Hi everybody, welcome to Indycar. My name is Gordon Rose. Today we're talking about framing. Not the kind of thing that you do with the picture, by the way, but the kind of thing that you do when you are talking about politics or asking people to think about making decisions about political issues. As I attended the event last night at Business for Scotland, which is about to start training over 1,000 new ambassadors for Yes, one of the things that was concentrated on at an early part of the evening was the business of how the political narrative is framed, how people see and understand the world around them, and what constructs they use in their own minds to deal with the realities of everyday life. Now, one of those constructs is the framing that the British state has managed to inculcate in everybody through the mass media. This is this impression of ourselves as some kind of state, some kind of British club that we're all members of, and that is all-encompassing and looks after us like a maiden aunt and makes sure that we're safe, takes decisions on our behalf, and we can trust them. Okay with me so far? So this is the general sort of outlook of the average British, in inverted commas, voter, something which the politicians have been reinforcing constantly down the decades by the use of state-controlled media such as the BBC. However, we as campaigners trying to convince people of the merits of voting for independence, in other words separating ourselves from this British state, cannot start to use the same frames that the British state already uses. For example, you remember the argument that goes, we're too wee, too poor and too stupid. Now that was an accidental quip made by, actually I think by Alex Salmond, if I remember correctly, when he was trying to describe how the British state uses people's impressions of their own country to frame the way they react to independence by giving us the impression that we are too poor, that we are too stupid, and that we're too small. But the point of this is that if we keep referring to these frameworks, as was pointed out at the evening last night, if we keep reinforcing these frameworks by constantly churning out these same words, even though we're saying we're not too small, we're not too poor, we're not too stupid, the fact is that we're reinforcing the frame. We're reinforcing those three words that people have got in their minds already. So when we come to try and convince people about the merits of independence, we need to reframe the entire argument using our own narrative, our own words, so that we don't constantly refer to the opposition's narrative, which just reinforces the ideas in people's minds. So we have to look for people who are going to be not susceptible, but people who are capable of thinking in two frames at once. Sometimes these are known as biconceptuals. These are people who maybe have a stricter frame of reference for, say, dealing with work, where they're much more conservative and they're much more rigid and much more, much more disciplined. But when they come home, they're far more sociable, far more loving, and far more morally driven. And the fact is that people can compartmentalise these aspects of their belief system. They can shut them away in little boxes. And that enables people who are fantastically greedy at work and make fantastic amounts of money to compartmentalise that as something which is okay because the politicians say that greed is good. And then they can go to church on a Sunday and accept the preaching of somebody who says it's bad to have too much wealth and we should give it away and we should all be nicer to one another. People are capable of compartmentalising like that quite regularly, and they can jump from one to another, one frame to another. So we have to create a frame in which they can easily move from where they are now into this new frame without feeling uncomfortable, unnatural, or at risk. So how do we do this? We have to present our case not as we are not too small, we're not too poor, we're not too stupid, as something completely different. We are too wealthy, we're too big, and we're far too smart to allow ourselves to be forcibly taken out of Europe by a neighbouring country. This is just an example of how you can frame things the other way around. When people argue with you and they say to you on the street, oh, but what about the deficit? Well, you could sit there and say, well, I'm going to argue the deficit and give them a whole lot of quotes and figures, but they will reject it because they have already been told that there's a deficit, they believe there's a deficit, and they believe the deficit is our own fault. So instead of going through the numbers with somebody who's just going to switch them off, you have to ask a different question. If they say to you, what about the deficit? You say, well, that's a very good question. Have you ever thought about who caused the deficit? Where did it come from? Was it Scotland that caused this deficit, or was it the British state borrowing too much money which caused the deficit? And then they're now sharing that deficit with us and making us responsible for it. You can turn these arguments around. But the thing is, we have to stop browbeating people who we know are not going to ever believe us, and have to triage, as they say, concentrate on those that we know can be saved. That's what triage is. Those who are past it, those who are dead to us, those people who are dyed-in-the-wool British nationalists who cannot change their views, who are too set in their ways. We don't do anything with them, because all it will do is, A, we'll argue with them and we'll waste our time. If we look at, say, people who are biconceptuals, who are capable of thinking about the positives of both independence and being in the UK, but who can jump between one and the other, we have a better chance there of converting somebody from a no voter to a yes voter. And there have been a lot of stories recently in our own media, on social media, of people who had been no voters and who have decided to switch to being a yes supporter. Many of them actually started marching recently, something which some people have said anecdotally they would never have dreamt of doing before, but now they are convinced and they become evangelists for the cause. There is no better evangelist for a cause than a recent convert, somebody who has had the wool pulled away from their eyes, who can see the truth of the matter. So what do? We create the narrative now. We create the buzzwords. I've been trying to do that a little bit on this show by creating things like GRIP, the grassroots independence people. That's everybody, that's us. We can use straplines like get a grip, get a better grip in Scotland, get a grip of our powers. You know, get a grip, everybody, is a strapline that we can use to frame our arguments. The grip idea is about pulling back what belongs to us, getting a grip on it, not letting it out of our grasp, not letting it be taken from us anymore. And this is the kind of narrative that we can frame quite easily and quite simply by just showing people what the alternative is to both the Tory government in London and the continuing chaos of an uncontrolled, unplanned Brexit. So it's down to us to start reframing how we deal with people. And this was the message that I took from the Ambassador night last night in Glasgow, which was an excellent event, incidentally. Brilliantly organised, with extremely good speakers and a very well thought out programme for training people, not to mention the fact that they will have an application for everybody that will be a resource, so that when you are talking to anyone, from a member of the public to a member of the press, you'll be able to have information at your fingertips directly from a bank of knowledge that we have, a bank of facts and information that you can then use when you're presenting the case. But it is important for us to move away from the language of the unionist, moving away from the way that the Tories control people's frames. Now, if you look back a little way, you'll remember that Ruth Davidson framed her entire campaign in the last general election on no to a second referendum. That was basically the entire policy. It was a monotheistic policy almost. It was one issue. We don't want another referendum. And she played on that, and she was aiming that at people who are fed up with referendums. Not, by the way, not aimed at particularly Tory voters, aimed at Labour voters, aimed at Liberal Democrat voters who are uncomfortable with the idea of having another referendum. Even if it's a perfectly legitimate, legal referendum, they just don't really like the idea of it. So this is how the Tories did it. They framed their arguments in simple terms, with a single fact, if you like. Not really a fact, but a single issue. And this is how Donald Trump's campaign won him the presidency with almost zero facts at his disposal and almost no policies at all other than telling people what they wanted to hear. And yet he still won because he framed his argument in the way that the people wanted it to be framed. It fitted with their worldview, their existing frame. That's what they wanted. He said to them, I will give you that if you vote for me. He didn't say how he would do it. He didn't say whether it was possible or affordable or where the money would come from or if anybody else would agree to it. He just promised it. And they voted for him like that because he presented it to them in that framework, in that way that they wanted it to be seen. For these biconceptual voters that I'm talking about, the ones who are capable of making the switch from no to yes, they're waiting to be convinced. They're waiting for somebody to make a good argument and to reframe the way they look at the politics of Scotland so that they stop and say, well, you have to ask people different types of questions. Who do you think is making a better job of running Scotland? Is it Theresa May or is it Nicola Sturgeon? Whether or not you like either of these women is irrelevant. Which one of them is doing the better job for Scotland? You can ask this sort of question. So when we come right down to it, what came out of last night's presentations for training us as ambassadors is that we have to change the way we speak to people. The words that we used to use, the words that we used to use to describe people we disagreed with, "un," for example, that has to go. Other words that have to go would be unionist. Unionist has very negative connotations, particularly because of Northern Ireland. We stop using this kind of language and we start to use language which is more conciliatory, more positive, and appeals to people's sense of fairness, people's sense of what's right and wrong, what's moral, what's good for the country, what is most fair for them, their family and their friends. When the referendum was held in 2014, I remember being puzzled as to why the British state went on and on and on about Britishness, about people's identity, how they saw themselves. The reason that the British state did this was to reinforce the British framework that people look at the world through. How British do you feel? Don't you feel British? Do you feel a wee bit Scottish? Well, that's okay, but you must feel British because you are British. Remember, we've been British for all this time. British, British, British. And it is this reinforcement of how do you feel? Are you a British subject? Are you a Scottish citizen? What's your identity? And what it was doing was playing to this framework, this positioning that people have of how they see themselves within society in general. Are they part of Britain? Or do they feel part of Scotland more? Do they identify as British or do they identify as Scottish? And the idea of this is that the British state relies on its media, its mainstream media, to keep reinforcing Britishness. That's why we have Great British Bake-Offs. That's why we have the British Broadcasting Corporation. We have the Great British this, the Great British that. Great Britain, by the way, is not a country. Great Britain just means the large island of Britain. Britain was the name the Romans gave to the island. The actual archipelago of all the islands, it used to be known as the British Isles. But we could quite equally say that it's the Scottish Isles that we are fighting for. We're fighting for the Scottish mainland and the hundreds of islands around it. You can change these narratives by using different terms. Anyway, I'll leave you with that today. But think about it. Think about the words that you're using. If you have questions or you want to volunteer to be a Yes ambassador, then contact Business for Scotland. They have a website and they will be taking people's requests to volunteer to be trained, and there will be training programs running all the way throughout this year, through this summer. And it is predicted that by just simply training up 1,000 people, if that 1,000 people then talk another 5 people, 5 of their friends into volunteering, then you're adding another 5,000 people to that list. And before very long, you've converted a lot of people. And not only are you converting them, but you're also training them as future ambassadors who are going to put this positive case. One last thing. It was mentioned last night, and I think this is important. Do not be afraid to be negative about what is going on in Britain, because during the independence campaign in 2014, the British state used fear as its primary weapon to dissuade us from voting yes. But the fear this time is not of independence, and we have to reinforce the idea that the thing that is most frightening is this unplanned, uncontrolled Brexit and what it will do to our jobs, our security, our export industries, and the gross domestic product, the amount of money that the country earns each year. That is the threat, and we can emphasise that. As well as emphasising the positives and being very nicey like we were last time, we also need to be quite hard and nasty and say, look, if you stay in the British state, you're going to get sucked down with the ship when it sinks with Brexit. Do you want that? Independent Scotland is the safe option now. The roles have completely reversed, and now what we're seeing is Scotland is the safety net for you. Being independent of the UK will save your jobs, save your industries, protect your exports, and so on and so on. We can present both sides. We don't have to be relentlessly positive. That can be quite wearing, actually. We can be positive about what we're doing, but we can equally be very negative about what the British state is doing in mishandling the entire Brexit process and mishandling the economy, borrowing even more money, and generally running the country's public services down to nothing. And we can make them frightened of America, because America is a threat, an existential threat to the entire nation of Scotland, its identity, its branding of products, all of which will be sacrificed in the name of a new deal with America after Brexit. Scotland will be thrown under the bus. We will become a region. Scotch whisky will be licensed for manufacture abroad, and jobs will migrate to North America. This is what the fear is. This is the reality. If we go down this road, America is going to take over. The United Kingdom is going to be another star on the Star-Spangled Banner. It's going to become the 51st state. We're going to have more nuclear weapons. We're going to be involved in more wars that we can't control and we have no say over. All of these fears can still be emphasised. But we then say, but you have a choice now. This is no longer a fight for fairness and democracy. This is a fight for the survival of Scotland as an actual country, with an actual identity and with actual powers to control what happens to its people. It's no longer about just wanting to be independent. It's about having to be independent, because we haven't got a choice anymore. If we don't go for independence, the country won't survive Brexit. It will be absorbed like the Borg absorbs and assimilates other species in Star Trek. We're going to be absorbed into this super British American conglomerate state. Do you want that? Or do you want to stay Scottish and stay clear and free from all of that? You will be able to decide on Europe yourself. You don't have to rejoin Europe. We're not fighting for us to stay in Europe. We're fighting for us to stay out of the UK and out of the clutches of Trump and the people who want to asset strip the country. Okay, I've talked long enough. That's it for today. I'm about to motor off and do some more work. So, talk amongst yourselves, think about what's been said. If you're interested in volunteering as a Yes ambassador, then please contact Business for Scotland. As I said, they have their own website and they will direct you to the right person to ask. You can sign up to be trained. You can also, once you are trained, help to train other people. So the knock-on effects of training as an ambassador will be great. And whether or not the referendum is held this autumn or not, we're going to be needed anyway. So regardless of what I think about when the referendum is going to be called, it is going to be called at some point, and we're going to need to be ready. And having thousands of ambassadors out on the streets talking to people in this way and reframing the argument so that we take it away from all of this nonsense and all these straplines that the UK uses to keep us down, and we start making up our own straplines. I made up grip, that's just an example, but there are others. Hoop, do you remember Hoop? Hands off our Parliament? It's still going. Hoop is actually visiting Dumfries. So these straplines, keep using them. Keep using hoop, keep using use the mandate, keep using independence, keep using grip, anything else that you think up yourself that makes a good strapline and a good hashtag, go for it. But stay clear of the British state's own language. Keep well away from the words that they use. Do not use them, even in a negative sense. We don't want to reinforce their ideas any further. That's it. End of message. See you later.